Shalom, friends. Welcome back to Judaism Unplugged. This episode is entitled, Where Do I Begin? And in this episode, we will begin the shorter, smaller vignettes looking at Jewish history. We're going to look at Jewish history rather uniquely. When I have taught Introduction to Judaism in the past, one of the things that I've found is that we all have a different approach to history. We all have different emphasis we put on it. We all have different styles of reading that we prefer. And so I've never assigned a particular reading text for history. And what I've tried to do in teaching the history is not to teach what we usually think of history as being names, dates, places, and events, but rather to give the big picture of history and allow and encourage my students to go pick up the Jewish history book of their choosing that best fits their needs and their tastes, and allow them to go out on their own with what I've given them and start to study Jewish history. In the process of doing that, I've been able to reduce Jewish history down, and it is a reduction, to 18 periods or points in history that I find to be particularly significant in terms of understanding the whole of the Jewish experience. There are, of course, more, and within some of the broader periods, there are more things going on than even I'll explain in the varying videos of this series. But you have to start somewhere. And as we noted in the introductory video to history, entitled Don't Know Much About History, and if you haven't watched that one yet, I encourage you to watch it next to give you some of the background for how we're approaching the history in these continuing vignettes. I raised the point in the conundrum of what the current Jewish year 5781 means. Because it turns out it doesn't have a lot of external significance for those who are not living the world through Jewish eyes. And the internal evidence doesn't support the number very well either. But I think the answer to the question for me is, it's the answer to the question, where do I begin? You've got to start somewhere. And indeed, the biblical text itself faced that very same phenomenon. And it was pointed out to us by the great medieval commentator Rashi, living in 11th century France, already subject to seeing the impact of the early Crusades, in which, even though the target of the Christian Crusaders was to knock the infidels out of the holy places of the Holy Land, and those infidels were the Muslims, by the way, a large number of Jews in Jewish towns and communities across Europe suffered extensively as collateral damage because we were the ones that the Crusaders attacked on the way to get themselves in shape to fight the Arabs, to fight the Muslims. So in Rashi's world, Jewish books were being destroyed. Jewish history and Jewish learning were being lost. And Rashi's biggest concern was to compile as much of that information into other sources so that it wouldn't be completely lost forever. And it turns out in the process, Rashi becomes a pretty good historian without intending to be on his own, in a couple of really unique ways. First, he's a great historian for students of the French language and its development, because whenever he couldn't figure out how to describe what he wanted to say in Hebrew in his commentary, he would spell it out phonetically in Hebrew characters in the Old French. And so Rashi's commentary on Torah becomes one of the great stashes of Old French vocabulary. Never intended. Great for historians of the French language and of French culture. But the other place where he becomes an outstanding historian is in his commentary on the story of creation, Genesis chapter 1. Because his question is, why does the book of Genesis begin here? Why does the Torah begin here? And it's a fascinating question from a Jewish perspective. Because by starting with creation of the universe, the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish Torah, the book of Genesis is starting by giving us a universal preamble to the beginning of Jewish history. We don't meet Abraham, the first Jew, until the very end of chapter 11 of the book of Genesis. So those first 10 and a half chapters are dealing with a world before the first Jew. The lessons we learn from that prehistory are universalized lessons that we apply to our unique Jewish experience. They situate us as a people, as a culture, within the larger world. They answer the universal questions that every great culture seeks to find the answers to for themselves. How did we get here? What is my purpose? What is our purpose? Why do bad things happen to good people? Questions like that. Not historical questions per se. But I believe, honestly, that's why those first 10 and a half chapters are there and written the way they are. But for Rashi, it's a question of, where do I start? And why do I start there as a Jew? And he gives several other really good alternatives for where Torah could have begun if its purpose was meant to be a uniquely Jewish history. We could have started with Abraham, the first Jew. We could have started at Mount Sinai, when the free Israelite people let out of the Egyptian slavery by Moses confront firsthand their commanding God's presence. We could start at the rescue at the sea. By emerging from the waters, the Israelites become a free nation. That would be a great place to start. And there are other places Rashi suggests as well. But in the end, none of those were chosen. And the Jewish story begins with creation. And it starts with a very stylized version of creation. Chapter 1 is God's version of creation. It's written from God's perspective. It's sparse in its detail. It's very, very rapid fire. God says, let there be. God makes it happen. God looks and sees that it's good. God gives it a name, and God moves on, which allows creation to happen, at least metaphorically, in 6 days. We'll look at that again when we look at texts. But when looking at Jewish history, it begins in no-nonsense fashion. And it begins at the beginning. And yet it begins with words that make clear that before the beginning, there was something. And so in the beginning of telling our own history, we Jews are admitting that history is frequently a riddle, a complex, seemingly contradictory set of experiences and data that needs to be unraveled. The first date, roughly, that I want us to look at is to try to identify that period in which Judaism begins. I've seen a couple of different significant numbers given for this. A lot of historians put the time of Abraham someplace around 1800 BCE. And let me make clear here, since we're talking about history from a Jewish perspective, when we tell time in years in secular terms, it's not secular. Time is divided into two periods, BC and AD. BC stands for before Christ. AD stands for Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord. Both of those obligate one to a belief in Christianity in their very language. And so when we Jews talk about history, we use the same numbers, but we use different abbreviations. For the earlier period, we use BCE, before the Common Era, which corresponds to BC. And for the later period of AD, we use CE for Common Era. Allows us to use the same numbers. But when you hear me refer to BCE and CE, now at least you'll understand why I'm not using the more familiar language and abbreviations. So one of the first settings of Abraham that many scholars buy into is someplace around the year 1800 BCE. I've seen it as late as 1500 BCE. It's interesting to try and backtrack it because there are so many pieces of seemingly strange data in those early Genesis stories about the lengths of lives lived. In the first 10 generations from Adam down to Noah, the average lifespan is someplace in the range of 800 to 900 years. In the 10 generations after the flood, from Noah down to Abraham, it quickly drops to 400 and then into the 200s, but still significantly longer than most of us moderns would look at and say, these are real numbers, based on our biases and our knowledges of ancient lifespans. Even when we get to Abraham himself, the numbers actually look more stylized than they do historical. Abraham lives for 175 years, Isaac for 181, Jacob for 147. And those who are good with numbers have actually figured out that that may be a numerical progression. That 175 is 7 times 5 squared. That 147 is 3 times 7 squared. And they see a progression in a mathematical progression that may have stylized the actual numbers and made them non-historical. But we get a period of 100 years of Abraham's life before Isaac is born. And then 60 years into Isaac's life, Jacob is born. And if we assume that Jacob starts having children about 40 and goes to about 60 for most of them, you've got a span of about 220 years for most of the story of what the Jews refer to as our patriarchs in the book of Genesis. So if it starts around 1800, it runs to about 1600. And a lot of how far back you feel the need to put it depends upon where you see the exodus from Egypt having happened, and that's going to be another video separate from this one. But within that time period, within that general framework of the first half of the second millennium BCE, we have the story of Abraham coming out of the Fertile Crescent, coming out with his wife, with his nephew and with a lot of followers who have been drawn to their idea that the moving force in the world is this unseen singular God that makes Abraham and his community somewhat unique. And in the early generations of Jewish history, the relationship between humanity and God is a very personal one. It's an individual covenant with an individual family that's passed on from father to son. So when the time comes, Abraham passes on, as part of the birthright, the covenant with God that he himself entered into. Jacob and his brother Esau appear to be fighting over receipt of that covenant. And then with the story of Jacob, the storytelling becomes less exact in terms of years, and it becomes harder to plug exact numbers in, whether we believe those numbers or not. But we do get this very interesting framework of the patriarchal period that takes place in the land of Canaan, with a couple of exceptions for a couple of stories during times of famine, and ends in the book of Genesis with us heading into Egypt for another famine. Because one of Jacob's sons, Joseph, has become, through a miraculous series of events, the second of command in Egypt, and has not only saved Egypt from the ravages of the famine, but will now save his own family as well. And so this entire book of Genesis, which ends with the death of Joseph, appears to be the prehistory of the Jewish people. Some are tempted to refer to it as being mythological, but not in the classical mythology sense. Judaism, being a monotheistic faith, is not going to tell our mythology with gods as the central figures. Rather, they're going to be our patriarchs, our founding individuals and their families. And so the characters of those early generations are shared in heroic saga form, living real lives with real strengths and real flaws. And they are the forebears of where proto-history is going to start and move into history itself as we move forward. And in different places, because again, the intent probably was not to be historical, but to be spiritual, to be moral in its teachings. We're given lifespans and years and lengths of lives, but they don't always add up to what we want them to. So in making the covenant originally with Abraham, one of the things God promises to Abraham is that his people will spend 400 years in a country not their own, in servitude to others, before God brings them back and gives them the land again. In the book of Exodus, at the time of the leaving of Egypt, we're told that the Israelites had been in Egypt for 430 years. But when we look at the texts itself and we look at the individual characters at the time of transition from the story going from individual heroic sagas to a more communal story, we're actually given a genealogy in which Moses, who leads us out of Egypt when he's 80 years old, is the seventh generation to Abraham's first generation. And therefore, if Jacob came into Egypt with his sons already, and maybe some of his older grandsons being born, Moses is 2 or 3 generations removed. And living 80 years will give him 2 more generations. That's 5 generations at most on that personal genealogy that are elsewhere defined as 400 years or 430 years. And it's clear there was no intent for any of this to be taken historically. And yet, this is part of our history as Jews. Not our living actual history, but our spiritual history. We still in our prayers refer to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as our founders. We still seek to be connected to God through connection to them. And so their place in the foundation upon which Jewish experience and Jewish history are built is unquestioned, even if the history around them is questioned dramatically. So for that first period of Jewish history, I give you the rough date of 1800 BCE and forward, the time of the patriarchs, the beginning of the Jewish belief in one unseen God, and heading into our entry into Egypt, from which we will emerge in the second time period that we'll look at in our next video. As always, if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them. Send them to me by way of the Temple Solel website, where you can get in touch with me directly. Until next time, shalom, friends. We'll see you soon.